The castle stones were never warm. That's something the guards knew in their bones, quite literally. Each step along those damp, ancient halls sent a shiver up their legs, as if the walls themselves whispered, "Socks won't help." And they didn't. Woolen or otherwise, socks were merely optimism woven into foot form. Welcome to a medieval winter shift at Castle Frostbottom. Not its real name, but it might as well have been. Perched atop a snoring hill like a chimneyless refrigerator, this castle was one of many scattered across Europe, drafted in generously by history and rather stingy when it came to insulation. Let's set the scene. It's the year of our Lord 1324. The air smells like boiled cabbage and soot. The fire in the hearth was last stoked sometime around Tuesday, though no one remembers which Tuesday. Outside, a snowstorm bellows gently against the arrow slits. Inside, a guard shifts for the 100th time inside his slightly too small helmet, and between shivers, a single unspoken question remains on his chattering lips. Why is this job always colder than it is dangerous? There are methods. Oh yes, there are methods. Firstly, layering. Not the sleek, thermal kind from the future, mind you, but the chunky, scratchy, never quite dry kind that often housed more fleas than warmth. The underlayer might be a linen shirt, tucked in, and pray it stays dry. Then a thick woolen tunic, stained with stew and heroism. Above that, perhaps a gambeson, the medieval padded jacket that looked like a quilt wore armour, though by the third watch of the night, it smelled bravely of old onions and courage, but still, the chill made it through, so they moved. Castle guards were rarely stationary for long when winter set in, pacing the walls, trotting in place, pretending for hours to hear distant horses that didn't exist, anything to keep circulation flowing. This was less about protection and more about maintaining their toes. When all else failed, warmth came from below, in the form of heated stones, glowing chunks of rock first baked beside the main hearth, then carefully transferred inside metal braziers or tucked into ceramic pots known as foot warmers. These were carried to strategic corners of the castle, near stairwells, gatehouses, even tucked shamefully beneath tunics, while pretending not to be cradling molten pebbles like newborn kittens. And then there was drink. Enter posset, a cozy, questionable potion of warmed ale or milk, curdled with eggs or lemon, sometimes both, then sneezed into with cloves and honey. Served at odd hours in wooden mugs, it wasn't delicious, but it was thick enough to remind you of warmth. It settled in the stomach like an old, drunk friend and burned all the way down in a way that suggested, "You'll regret this later, but you won't feel cold." The wealthier guards, or those fortunate enough to work near the Lord's Hall, might happen upon something truly rare, a hearth fire. Now, these weren't just for decoration. A good fireplace wintered more than just rooms. It served as a gossip chamber, ham cooker, sock dryer, an occasional cat conference. But unlike fairy tales, fire wasn't a free-for-all. Wood was expensive. Every log burned was an accounting decision. Guards might gather around for mere minutes before being chased off by a steward, wielding a ledger instead of a sword. So, how did they stay warm? They didn't. Not really. They endured. They joked. They huddled close, not romantically, but out of mutual frostbite avoidance. They wrapped dogs in cloaks and called it morale. They learned to stare into torchlight like it might promise spring. And sometimes they sang. Low songs. Chill, thickened folk tunes with lyrics that made less sense as the night aged. Songs about stews thick enough to stand a spear in. Songs about breaches forgotten by the fire. songs that turned frostbite into legend and chilblains into character. And somehow, the night went on. Stars wheeled overhead. The snow whispered its secrets into the moat. And beneath their chainmail and goosebumps, castle guards kept the first watch, second watch, and sometimes a third. If these stories helps you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now rest, dear listener. We've only just begun. Now, before we begin marching through icy courtyards or clinking around damp stone towers, let's take a brief moment to appreciate just how badly medieval castles were designed for comfort. Yes, our romantic daydreams of noble banquets and roaring fireplaces tend to skip over the reality that castles, even the fanciest, most turreted specimens, were really just giant, drafty stone refrigerators. Now picture this. It's the year 1297. The frost clings to the parapets like a particularly stubborn in-law. Snowflakes the size of porridge bowls are meandering their way down from the grey blotted sky. And there you are, a poor, underpaid castle guard standing on the wind-whipped wall walk, squinting into the distance for any sign of trouble, while your toes slowly lose their will to live. What then was a medieval guard to do? Wool, my dear friend. Glorious, unpretentious wool. If the medieval world gave out awards for material most likely to prevent the loss of limbs to frostbite, wool would win every century. Guard uniforms were layered upon layer of rough-spun, earthy-smelling wool. Cloaks, leggings, tunics, undershirts. If a sheep had grown it, a castle guard would wear it, sometimes even twice. Without washing, you'd want to stay upwind. And lest you imagine a closet full of cozy cable-knit cardigans, let me gently correct your image. Medieval wool garments were more itchy survival patchwork and less yarned hug from grandma. But they did their job, especially once a bit of lanolin, natural oil from sheep, was left in. Surprisingly water-resistant, sheep grease became the unsung hero of many frosty vigils. You haven't truly experienced the wild resourcefulness of history until you've known the comfort of slightly greasy underclothes. Now, aside from wool, there was another layer of warmth rarely mentioned in heroic ballads: grime. Yes, unwashed guards often benefited from what you might call biolayering. Layers of dirt, sweat, and vague regrets that sealed in body heat surprisingly well. Medieval hygiene standards were not so much lax as intentionally evasive. A warm guard was a stinky guard, and a stinky guard had fewer interruptions during his shift, as even rats would think twice before approaching. Of course, if you were especially lucky, or had proven competent enough not to fall asleep during goat herding watch duty, you might get stationed near the brazier. A brazier, not to be confused with a brazier, though both bring warmth depending on context, was a metal pan full of burning coals. Positioned in sheltered nooks of castle walls or tucked inside gatehouses, braziers were like ancient space heaters, only far less safe and infinitely sootier. Guards huddled around them like medieval moths to a medieval flame, trying to toast hands, helmets, or in rare cases, the week's stale biscuit. But fire had its frustrations. A wind-blasted tower could render your coal stove useless, fizzling out hours of effort with a single well-timed gust. And then you'd be back to jump squats and shivering prayers to St. Camillus, the patron of the cold and uncomfortable. Fine, we made that last part up, but he really should be considered. Let's not forget the world of makeshift medieval hand warmers. Hot stones, wrapped in cloth, secretly hugged under cloaks like precious, awkward pillows. Heat would wear off quickly, but the momentary bliss of a warm rock on your belly could briefly eclipse the bone-chilling gloom of January. In underground guard quarters, you might also find a simple innovation: the straw mattress beside a shared hearth. Yes, not everyone stood outside all night. Some guards rotated shifts and stayed below, where the chill was more of a sulk than a shriek. But shared hearths brought competition, and the first person to fall asleep nearest the fire often woke up shoeless, or in worse cases, singed. Still, a few scorched toes was better than frozen ones, and castle camaraderie often softened the worst nights. And believe it or not, some guards even sang. Quietly, reverently, strange old ballads passed down through broken-toothed generations. Singing not only lifted spirits, but helped keep rhythm when pacing the walls, moving just enough to trick the muscles into remembering they still existed. So yes, staying warm was less a science and more a series of itchy, smoky rituals. But it worked. Most of the time. Snow may have silenced the Moors, but inside the castle walls, guards battled the cold with whatever they had: wool, hot rocks, and the eternal hope that their shift would end before frost claimed their left ear. Up ahead, across the ice-slick courtyard, something flickers, perhaps torchlight, or perhaps the golden glow of a cleverly contained hearth deep in the belly of the castle kitchens, where comfort and heat waited in savoury, barren contrast. The stone corridors of a medieval castle did not, despite what romantic novels might whisper, come with central heating or floor-length tapestries made of fire-retardant fleece. No, castle walls were thick not for insulation, but defence. The kind that kept arrows out, but did nothing whatsoever to keep noses warm. And so, the castle guard, that weary fellow clinking about the ramparts every evening with a halberd in one hand and chilled determination in the other, devised an impressive repertoire of ways to battle the deep, cold sighs of medieval winter. None of them were particularly glamorous. Most of them involved sheep. Shall we begin with layers? Because if there's one thing medieval guards understood better than guard duty, it was the principle of the more the merrier when it came to clothing. Wool underclothes, wool overclothes, wool between those clothes, plus a surcoat, a cloak, and in moments of extreme chill, someone else's spare cloak. Sharing, of course, was encouraged except when it came to underthings. There were lines even the frost could not persuade men to cross. Now imagine a guard named Lyle. We'll call him Lyle because it sounds appropriately medieval-ish and slightly disgruntled, which suits our purposes. Lyle often took the night watch, cursed with the unforgiving wind that licked through the arrow loops of the western tower. His only companionship on many nights was the sullen glow of a tallow lamp and his increasingly elaborate complaints to passing bats. Lyle had a trick, though, passed down from a cousin who claimed to have once sneezed in the presence of a bishop and lived to tell the tale. This trick was known as the goosey foot rap. You see, the guards discovered early on that stuffing the soles of their leather boots with goose down helped trap heat. Geese, after all, are nature's most reluctant volunteers in the war against frostbite. It wasn't high fashion, but it did mean fewer complaints of frozen toe and significantly fluffier footwear. There's something quietly humorous about a battle-hardened guard tiptoeing across cobblestones with each step sounding faintly buoyant. Warming stones were another unsung hero. Heated in the castle's great hearths and swaddled in cloth, these stones could be slipped beneath cloaks or into pockets, functioning as medieval hot water bottles with none of the water and all of the soot. Think of them as portable radiators, unevenly effective and liable to burn you if you got cocky. But in the depths of a northern winter, mildly singed was a step up from knuckle-numbed. There was, too, the ever-popular guard shift shuffle, a form of medieval cardio, not unlike a strange blend of marching and stamping, sometimes incorporating the occasional jig. The idea was simple: keep moving or become a decorative icicle with opinions. These shuffles might appear spontaneous, but over time they evolved into something of a ritual. Some castles, it's rumoured, even had unofficial competitions for the most elaborate footwork among the guards. The prize, bragging rights, a slightly warmer shift, and possibly the company of a mildly impressed kitchen maid who enjoyed a good rhythmic stomp. Now, some resourceful guards took their warmth pursuits a step further, literally, by nesting themselves close to, or occasionally inside of, the castle kitchens or bakehouses. Here, bread ovens glowed with the kind of heat that made squatting beside them not just sensible, but something approaching spiritual rebirth. Guard duty, positioned near the castle bakery, was highly coveted, for reasons beyond just fermented dough and wistful aromas of rye. It's hard to feel entirely despondent when surrounded by the scent of rising bread and the warmth of yestermorning's coals. For those truly desperate, or perhaps simply innovative, livestock posed a final option. Being stationed near the stables or sharing a small nook with a castle hound offered not just comic companionship, but surprising thermal synergy. There's an unspoken warmth to be found in the dignified shuffle of a cow or the judgmental sniff of a castle dachshund. Their body heat, combined with their uninspiring conversation, made guards feel both warmer and more intellectually secure. Not all tactics were effective, mind you. Some involved holding a mug of warm ale for so long it grew cold. Some involved muttered curses sent skyward, and a few brave souls tried rubbing brandy on their cheeks, a plan that neither warmed nor spared their dignity. Still, there under the stars and hoarfrost, bundled like reluctant shepherds of stone and silence, the guards held their post. Wind stirring their cloaks, goose feathers stuffing their shoes, and a faint rhythm of shuffling boots echoing through the winter night. And somewhere high above, soot-streaked smokestacks leaned into the sky with a whisper, carrying with them the scent of damp wool, scorched turnips, and something faintly magical brewing inside the castle kitchen. Deep within the stout belly of a 13th century stone castle, where cold draughts snuck through arrow slits like invisible spies on frosty missions, lived a curious creature known to locals as the courtyard hobnobber. Technically, that was just a guard named Edwin, but owing to his habit of loitering near the kitchen door in full armour while pretending to inspect snowflakes, he'd earned a reputation less for bravery and more for an uncanny knack at locating warmth in a world otherwise composed entirely of stone, iron, and the occasional goose. See, most people imagine castle guards as stoic, immovable, possibly carved from oak, and while they certainly stood tall during sieges and ceremonies, their most valiant battles were often waged at dawn in temperatures cold enough to freeze one's moustache mid-huff. Wearing chainmail during December in Yorkshire was a bit like wrapping yourself in a medieval refrigerator shelf and then agreeing to stand in a strong wind for 4 hours. Chainmail didn't insulate, it merely gave you the chills in high definition. Metal, after all, is not known for its cozy properties. And yet, guards couldn't very well show up in their wooliest nightshirts on patrol. Dignity demanded chivalry. And chivalry, it seems, demanded mild frostbite. But necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. And the castle guard's cold weather toolkit was a little more inventive than one might expect. For starters, layers. So many layers. You might think of modern soldiers as heavily geared up. Flak vests, tactical belts, night vision goggles. Medieval guards, by contrast, wore enough padding under their armour to resemble armoured pastries. The gambeson, a quilted, padded jacket made of linen stuffed with wool or scraps of whatever wasn't currently being used as a tablecloth, formed the warm core. Some were stitched so thick they were practically wearable mattresses. Add a hooded coif, some thick hose, and leather boots, sometimes stuffed with straw, because nothing screams creativity like DIY insulation, and you had a passable approximation of a wearable hearth. But even the best bundled guards soon discovered what every modern winter commuter knows. Standing still is the quickest path to turning into a human snow pebble. So, guards did what any reasonable cold sufferer with a halberd would do. They became excellent pace walkers. Patrol routes were not just strategic decisions. They were secret cardio. Around the battlements, through the yard, past the stables, and, most critically, nearby the Great Hall, where a passing window might gift you with a whiff of roasted rabbit and a momentary hit of hearth-warmed air. And then there were the fires. Oh, the fires. While it's easy to imagine flickering braziers artfully arranged along icy corridors, as if everyone lived inside a moody candlelit film, reality leaned more towards smoky tin bucket of embers haphazardly positioned and reluctantly approved by the steward. Braziers were rare, tightly rationed, and viewed warily. Fire and stone make for odd castle bedfellows, and nobody liked surprises in the roof timbers. Still, a clever guard might sidle up to the kitchens when soup was on, or volunteer for gate duty if the portcullis chamber had a bit of warmth from nearby blacksmithing work. Not warm exactly, but less frozen, which, in the grim calculus of medieval comfort, counted as victory. Then there were the warming stones, heated bricks or rounded stones, lifted from the hearth and wrapped in cloth, delivered somewhere between tolerable warmth and mild disappointment. Tucked under cloaks or held in gloved palms, they offered the same comfort as holding a half-toasted potato, which incidentally was another common trick, a spare root vegetable heated in coals and then carried around as an edible, starchy hand warmer. Outside, wind moaned across the battlements like a bard who had lost both his lute and his lunch, while Edwin the hobnobber, ever resourceful, invented one final technique: mild abandonment of post. Just a step or two inside the shadows of a storeroom, particularly one housing barrels of pickled herring or surplus flour. Unofficial, slightly frowned upon, but blissfully out of the wind. Edwin might hum softly to himself. "Ah," he'd say aloud to no one. "Still on patrol, just patrolling this very promising barrel of barley." And while no one ever formally wrote it down, parchment wasn't exactly lined with exposés. There is every reason to believe that a great many castle guards survived the worst of medieval winters, not through epic bravery, nor sheer endurance, but by simply mastering the art of knowing where the warmth leaked out. And in the stillness of the snow-touched keep, where footfalls echoed like whispers and even icicles had grown bored of themselves, something else awaited. A wardrobe oddity that turned warmth into an ensemble. The curious, almost heroic winter hat. One might assume the castle guards of medieval Europe went to bed each night with a cheerful fire crackling nearby, a goblet of mulled wine in one hand, and perhaps a lute-playing squire stroking a gentle ballad into the winter gloom. Alas no, The castle guards, bless their frostbitten toes, had a less operatic reality. A reality filled with chilly watchtowers, questionable cloaks, and the sharp betrayal of stone floors in January. Let us turn our gaze upward now, through frost-edged arrow slits, to where a lone guard stands on the parapet, looking vaguely heroic and deeply uncomfortable. He shifts from boot to boot, a dance as old as castles themselves. It's called the medieval two-step, performed to ensure one's feet remain on speaking terms with one's body. But surely, you ask, castle designers thought of heating? Ah, you sweet summer child. You clearly have never tried to light a fire atop a battlement. Fireplaces were for the great hall, the Lord Solar, and occasionally a particularly lucky kitchen mouse. The guards? Their warmth came from wool, wits, and the fleeting hope of an early spring. Clothing was the first defense. Layers and layers of it. Tunic over shirt, cloak over tunic, regret over cloak. Wool was the fabric of choice, not because it was luxurious, it wasn't, but because it stayed warm even when damp, which it frequently was. Rain, snow, fog. Sometimes all three visited at once, like tragic brothers from a very gloomy fairy tale. The cloaks worn by guards were typically thick, hooded, and made to shrug off weather like an irritated cat shrugs off affection. Underneath, some guards wore padded gambesons, think quilted jackets designed more for battle than bedtime. Still, those layers trapped body heat, especially when combined with what historians politely call internal combustion, the kind produced by a hearty diet of beans, turnips, and the occasional fermenting onion. Many guards swore by the art of movement. Standing still meant freezing. Pacing meant, well, slightly slower freezing. But at least the blood circulated. Guards developed a familiar round along the walls and towers, giving their shift the rhythm of a slow medieval waltz. Some even did squats. Yes, medieval squats, centuries before fitness influencers discovered them. Others preferred leaning against slightly warmer interior walls, exchanging tales while pretending they didn't hear their teeth chattering in Morse code. In colder castles, those carved from stone and situated boldly atop some howling cliff, the solution was a small brazier. These metal pots held hot coals, carefully monitored lest the garrison accidentally roast themselves instead of the enemy. When allowed, guards would huddle around these glowing sentinels like moths dressed in chainmail. Firewood was precious though, often hoarded for kitchens or noble quarters. If a guard was caught borrowing a log or two for personal toasting purposes, he might find himself warming the dungeon instead. Then there was the buddy system, a survival tactic as old as winter itself. Much like modern campers in a frosty tent, guards sometimes shared cloaks or even huddled back to back to preserve warmth. Historians say little about this because it isn't grand or romantic, but solidarity, especially in the form of shared body heat, may have saved more limbs than all the cloaks in Christendom. Some castles, particularly in more northern or unrelenting climates, employed clever if modest tricks. Thick tapestries were hung along interior guard rooms, not just for looks, but to act as insulation. Animal skins were piled in outposts. Rumour has it one lucky guard in Scotland once spent an entire January shift wrapped in 3 wolf pelts and a sarcastic smile. And of course, there was drink. Not too much. One does not want a tipsy man holding a halberd near a slippery stairwell, but just enough to keep morale and circulation flowing. Warm ale, spiced with herbs or honey, made the rounds in still rooms. Hot broth, a peasant's potion, sometimes made its way from the kitchens to the guards if the cook was feeling generous, or if the guards were very good at not gambling away their socks. Despite the chill, despite the wind scouring their cheeks into scarlet leather, there was a quiet pride among the guards. They watched while others slept. They secured the dreaming world, and sometimes, if they were very lucky, the stars above were clear, their cold light brushing against frostbitten towers like winter's lullaby. And as dawn approached, slipping like a timid fox across the castle's eastern edge, the guards' thoughts drifted toward their replacements, and toward the little alcove by the kitchen chimney, where, if they timed it just right, they might find both warmth and leftover stew. But before we get there, we must first descend into the castle's depths, where warmth took on a far more unexpected form. Ah, yes, the dining hall, a key location for any castle guard hoping to survive the unforgiving chills of a medieval winter. And not just survive, but do it with a belly full of something vaguely warm and occasionally alive. Because nothing says ready for night watch like questionable meat stew gently congealing in a wooden bowl by firelight. Now, to the untrained eye, the word dining might evoke images of candlelit feasting, goblets clinking, and the faint lute solo in the distance. But for most castle guards, dining was more of an act of sustenance than ceremony, and an essential moment in the sacred art of thawing out one's toes. Picture it, a stocky man named Osric, wrapped in layers of scratchy wool, clumping into the great hall just as the sun surrendered behind the battlements, his nose red, his breath forming lazy little clouds, and a strong desire radiating from his boots. Warmth. He was met by the flickering glow of a hearth large enough to roast a sheep, and often did. Beside it, the cook, a woman named Mildred, whose signature dish was a concoction known only as the mash. Its true ingredients remained a state secret, protected under royal silence and perhaps mild embarrassment. Soup, if one could call it that, was the staple weapon in the medieval anti-hypothermia arsenal. Broths made from bones that had already seen too much, onions that had seen better days, and herbs that bravely clung to life despite being stored next to a barrel of pickled turnips. Guards would line up, wooden bowls in hand, hoping for at least a warm splash of gravyish goodness, and maybe a crust of bread harder than their will to patrol at midnight. But Mildred knew what she was doing. The stew might have been mysterious, but it was hot, hearty, and had this magical ability to glue warmth to your insides like a wool blanket for your ribcage. Some guards swore it had restorative properties. Others believed it caused vivid hallucinations involving goats. But either way, it got the job done. Hot food wasn't just for flavor or morale, though morale was often in short supply, squeezed somewhere between frozen socks and perpetual dampness. No, it was survival. Eating something hot forced the body to work and warm itself from within. It was the original central heating system, soup and mild gastrointestinal confusion. And as the guards ate, they didn't just warm their bellies. They shared stories, groaned about the cold, and swapped frostbite prevention tips that ranged from sensible advice to complete lunacy. Like Trig, the one-armed archer who swore that stuffing your boots with cabbage leaves kept your toes from freezing. And Gilda, who once claimed she slept with a hot rock tucked into her undergarments, a decision she later regretted when it cracked in half and scorched her dignity. It was in this mealtime camaraderie that another method of staying warm emerged: laughter. Long, wheezing laughter, jokes, boasts, and the occasional dramatic retelling, of how Mad Edric once tried to warm his chainmail in the fire and melted it into a decorative collar. The dining hall acted as both kitchen and comedy club, the kind of double booking you only see in very cold places. Meals also meant regular trips to the privy, a genuinely risky operation in sub-zero temperatures. But even that was, in a twisted way, part of the warming routine. Get up, walk briskly, swear softly, do your business, and return. Movement encouraged circulation, and circulation is how fingers remember they belong to you. And then slowly, the hall emptied, one bowl at a time, until only the snores of a napping dog and the soft crackle of fire remained. Osric would tighten his scarf, pat his now warm stomach, and mentally prepare himself for the long night atop the ramparts. He did not relish the ice on the stone steps, or the bitter wind that snuck in through every conceivable crack in castle architecture. But he was warm for now, warm and full of mystery mash. And not all battles were fought with swords. Some were fought with spoons, ladles, and an unnatural tolerance for parsnips. But of course, the meal was just the beginning. Warmth wasn't kept by food alone. There was still the matter of bedding, layering, and one of the oddest practices of medieval warmth maintenance, the curious case of the communal bed pile. Tucked beneath centuries of frostbitten stone and smoky torches, there was one quiet strategy that warmed the hearts and toes of medieval guards more than any fur-lined boot or blazing brazier could. Friendship. Well, and also fireplaces. But let's start with friendship, because it's at least as warm and infinitely more flammable in the form of gossip. You see, there were moments between the dreary patrols where guards found refuge not just beside the hearth, but within each other's dramatic recountings of who glanced suggestively at the washerwoman near the well, or which knight may have accidentally or intentionally moved a banner 2 inches left, thus violating heraldic protocol and the honor of 3 generations. These fireside chats, whatever the weather outside, made the cold stones of the guard towers feel almost like home. A home with drafty corridors and occasional invasions, but home nonetheless. Of course, literal warmth still mattered, and that's where the warming rooms came in. These little medieval miracles were dotted around castles like luxurious secrets. They were small, tucked-away chambers, built near the kitchens or above the bakehouse, where the ambient heat from roasting meat or griddle cakes would seep into the walls and render the room suitable for slightly smug lounging. While not officially designated for guards, one can only imagine the guards' boots accidentally finding their way near such radiant sanctuaries. In the kitchens below, cauldrons sang with bubbling stews and poppy-flecked loaves crackled in ovens, releasing warmth that swirled up through vents. Not vents in the modern sense, mind you. These were just holes, but holes with purpose. Much like medieval plumbing, they were effective, somewhat unpredictable, and occasionally full of mice. Guards lucky enough to draw assignments near these structures reported a suspicious enthusiasm for bread-stacking duties or watching the soup, while everyone else froze slightly into their chainmail. You could hardly blame them. Guarding the spice chest in a scalding cinnamon-scented room beat standing atop a blizzard-kissed wall while birds judged you from the rafters. But sometimes warmth had to be portable. Enter the hand warmer. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, cleverness thrived. These were small metal or ceramic containers of embers, often tucked into muff-like sleeves or even hidden beneath cloaks. Imagine an ill-tempered teapot with a purpose, to smolder discreetly under your armpit. They required just the right touch. Too much heat and your undercoat caught fire. Too little and you developed the kind of numb fingers that made sword holding more theoretical than practical. Then came the fur. Fur was everywhere, on cloaks, in boots, lining helmets, for those who wanted to feel like a particularly cozy marmot, and even attached to the edges of gloves, serving fashion and function with equal parts flair and frostbite prevention. Castle guards weren't fashion icons per se, but the sight of a grizzled sentry swaddled in hair pelts and muttering to his feather-lined gloves was surely something to behold. Let's not forget straw, the unsung hero of medieval insulation. Packed between floorboards or stuffed into undershirts. Yes, you heard that right. Straw was dry, mostly lice-free if you were lucky, and surprisingly effective at keeping vital organs from becoming winter knackered. The best guards mastered the art of shifting their bedding straw daily to avoid cold spots and uninvited rodent co-tenants. Anyone with a fondness for symmetry or allergies had a rough go of it. In moments of despair, and there were many when wind whistled through wall slits like a banshee with a grudge, some guards allegedly whispered to the castle cats for warmth and companionship. It wasn't outlandish. Cats have always known where the warmest spots are, in laps, near fires, and on woolen tabards someone left unattended for 5 minutes. A purring companion atop your chest may not have been part of regulation armor, but it certainly beat hypothermia. And when the long night watches stretched on, and the fires glowed dim to a hazy ember, the guards would huddle, sometimes literally, and share stories of summers long past or winters far worse. There's something profoundly warming about the phrase, "At least this isn't the frost of '87. That winter, it was said even the moat froze solid and a goose skated across it wearing a Knight's Lost helmet. Unverified, of course, but the image endured. As the stars sagged toward morning and frost painted the arrow slits with feathered lace, the guards, stiff-kneed and suit-marked, would trade yawns and elbow nudges, their breath curling like quiet ghosts in the lantern light. And just as their shift ended, and they made their way towards sleep and straw mattresses of their own, the scent of slowly warming beer would rise from the kitchens below. Because warmth came in many forms, some hugging your head, others filling your cup. But there was one particular place in the castle where warmth was stored, not in fire or fur, but in something far more unexpected. As you tiptoe further into the icy corridors of medieval castles, where the wind echoes like a gossiping ghost and the walls are thick enough to host a polite bear, you might wonder, did the guards just shiver stoically until spring, or did they have a few tricks beneath those chainmail skirts? Well, here's the thing. Castle guards weren't just brave, they were terribly practical, because courage may win you a sword fight, but it doesn't keep your kneecaps from freezing off before noon. To begin, let us descend into one of the many underappreciated heroes of medieval warmth, the humble woolen undergarment, before strapping on heavy armor or the kind of fur cloak that looked suspiciously like your aunt's hunting dog. Most guards layered up in scratchy but enthusiastic woolen tunics and underbreeches. These weren't the sleek thermals of modern ski resorts. No, these were often hand-knit, slightly damp, and smelled permanent. But, oh, were they warm, and slightly flammable. In castles of the northern realms, Scotland, northern France, parts of Germany, winters weren't mildly nippy. They were the kind of cold that made your teeth rattle out Morse code. So the guards developed strategies. For one, standing near the inner wall was wiser than the outer. The inner walls retained a bit more warmth, especially if your post was blessedly close to a kitchen, forge, or the Lord's prized fireplace. Guards had a saying, choose a post near stew, and you'll survive through. Or they would have, had they the time for rhyming in the frostbitten breeze. Some lucky guards, stationed indoors or in covered corridors, those winding passageways they called chemin de ronde, might pace slowly on patrol, their boots thunking against frosted stone, the sound rhythmic, lulling, almost like the ticking of a very bored clock. These guards mastered the art of movement, not too fast to avoid drawing suspicion, and not too slow to avoid transforming into a ceremonial ice sculpture, a technique known fondly in modern terms as the medieval shuffle. But what of those guards doomed to watch from high towers, exposed to the biting wind that had nothing better to do than nibble at human ears? Well, here enters the glory of animal skins. Wolf furs, bearskin wraps, thick leather gloves lined with rabbit fluff. They wore the forest draped across their shoulders like a statement. Sometimes, the fur still had personality. But in general, fashion bent easily to function. And if it got especially cold, wailing wind, icy fog, battlement stones cracking softly like cereal, soldiers were permitted to carry hot bricks. Yes, bricks. Heated in the fireplaces below, wrapped in cloth, and clutched like sleepy cats to their cores. Temporary warmth, yes, but in a long night, even a toasty rock was a blessing. Of course, nothing compared to the glory of a brazier, a metal container filled with hot coals, placed strategically on battlements and watchtowers if the Lord was feeling generous, or if the budget allowed it, because fewer frostbitten guards was, economically speaking, good business. Guards could shuffle over, warm their numbing fingers above the glow, and feel, for just a few minutes, as if life weren't entirely a cruel joke. Keep in mind, hilariously, that armor was cold. Very cold. It was metal after all. Chainmailed in the morning was a freezing handshake from fate. That's why the underlayers were so critical. You didn't want steel kissing your bare skin, unless you enjoyed the feeling of betrayal. And yes, there were flasks. Medicinal flasks, full of mead, ale, or herbal concoctions with everything short of fire in them. Now, officially, drinking on duty was discouraged, but in the kind of cold that made your nose hair freeze. Let's just say a little nip of hot mulled wine was easily forgiven, especially if the captain was just as red-cheeked. In some castles, guards even took turns on warmth rotation. One stood out on the rampart, pretending to be stoic and not sneezing, while the other enjoyed the brief ecstasy of a warm guard room, if the castle had one, with a hearth and perhaps a grumpy old hound dreaming about chasing sausages. Then they switched. Fair is fair after all. So no, the guards weren't magical. They just worked with what they had: wool, fur, fire, fermented courage, and the sheer stubbornness of someone who's too cold to care anymore. And as the midnight wind howled like a werewolf in theatre school, they curled their fingers tighter into their mittens, or chainmail gloves with wool stuffed inside, and sang songs about spring returning one day. Maybe, but not tonight. Tonight, in the next spiral turn of stone stairs and sleepy snowflakes, we'll tiptoe into the flickering shadows of the great hall's fireplace, a place where both gossip and soup simmer overnight, just beyond the fifth gatehouse of Castle Landegruff, a name that sounds like it was invented mid-sneeze. There was a little stone alcove where guards could hide from the worst of the Welsh winter winds. The wind had a nasty habit of slipping through arrow slits and dancing mockeries around uninvited drafty corners. And yet, despite these architectural quirks and the general medieval aversion to insulation, the guards somehow didn't freeze into popsicles of chivalry. So how did they do it? Well, as with most things in history, it involved a curious cocktail of practicality, superstition, and sheep. Lots of sheep. Let's begin with the most basic defense against the biting cold: clothing. But not just any clothing. Layers of wool thick enough to qualify as property lines. Picture this: a guard waking from a nap in the barracks, groaning as he dons a linen shirt, then pulls over it a woolen tunic, then a second tunic, then a hooded mantle, and then a short cloak. By the time he's kitted out, he's less man and more walking laundry pile. Some swore by sheepskin cloaks, fur-lined gloves, and boots stuffed with hay, or, for the more luxurious, rabbit fur slippers that screamed, "I conquered a manor, and all I got was this absurdly cozy footwear." Then there were tabards, those sleeveless overgarments with the castle's emblem sewn on. More for show, really, but some clever knights sewed little pockets inside them, not for daggers, but for warming stones. Warming stones smooth and the size of a large biscuit, the proper British kind, not the flaky American pastry in disguise, were heated by the fire and tucked into gloves or boots like primitive, slightly scorched hot water bottles. Of course, if you weren't careful, you'd end up with warmer boots and second-degree burns. But these were simpler times. Men were tough and slightly crispy. Inside the castle, posts near the great hearth, were coveted guard rotations. A man tasked with watching the tapestry-clad corridor might find his shift less about vigilance and more about not dozing off in the amber glow of a roaring fire. That is, unless he was caught snoring. Then he'd be reassigned to tower watch duty, which meant standing on a windy turret trying to look brave while avoiding icicles forming on your nose hairs. In more innovative households, guards made use of a primitive but surprisingly effective contraption: the foot brazier. A shallow metal pan filled with embers dragged from room to room like a portable glow of happiness. Of course, more than one guard suffered a scorched boot and singed pride when these were kicked over in the midst of a sword demonstration or an overly excited sneeze. And let's not forget, Celtic guards often swore by a mug of mead or warmed ale to chase off the chill. A mildly alcoholic haze made everything feel cozier, like your insides had been wrapped in a velvet blanket and promised a song. Though after the third mug, you might mistake a tapestry of St. George for a fire-breathing threat and start slashing at the embroidery. There were other tricks too, like wrapping wool around the tips of pikes so they didn't freeze to your fingers, or stuffing your helmet with sheep's wool, partly for insulation, and partly to muffle the shrieking wind. It's entirely possible that some early forms of earmuffs began as an overly ambitious helmet wool prototype. One particularly dedicated guard, whose name is lost to history, but we'll call him Colbert, once trained himself to clench his toes in rhythm, believing it stoked inner warmth. For 15 winters, he towed his way through tower watches, becoming as much part of the ramparts as the stones themselves. But perhaps the most effective method of all was sheer camaraderie. A few guards huddled close on the night watch, sharing warmth, stories, and the occasional loaf of baked rye. They laughed, groaned at the same jokes, and found comfort in being uncomfortable together. There's a warmth that comes not from a fire or a heavy cloak, but from shared misery turned into tradition. And so, within thick stone walls and under a sky laced with frost, these medieval sentinels endured, not because of any single great invention, but through 1,000 tiny shivering adaptations, proof that sometimes history is less about glory and more about not freezing solid before your shift ends. Now, as the castle sleeps beneath its snowy mantling, let us venture somewhere a touch warmer, perhaps inside a medieval kitchen, where another set of guards found heat, hustle, and the promise of something bubbling in a pot. While the biting wind battered against the ramparts and moaned through the murder holes. Yes, that's the actual name for those intimidating architectural features. There stood the castle guard, stoic as ever atop the frosty battlements. But let us pause here and kindly set aside the idealized image of a chisel-jawed sentry, cape fluttering heroically in the blizzard. In truth, medieval guards were often less Arthurian knight and more layers of wool-clad popsicle. A man can only be so noble when he can't feel his eyebrows due to frostbite. Now, keeping warm in a medieval castle was a game of strategy. If you were stationed outside on night watch, you had very few allies, gravity, for when you could lean against the wall without being scolded. Breathing, the visible kind, became entertainment. And of course, the holy ensemble of layers. Guards wore so many layers that dressing for winter was a bit like trying to smuggle 5 sheep under your tunic. There were woolen undershirts, padded gambesons, which were thankfully good for both warmth and being hit with sharp metal. Cloaks heavy enough to double as snowplows, and if you were particularly lucky or had access to the Lord's laundry, they might even be partially moth-free. Contrary to our modern preference for snug, heated gloves, the medieval solution for freezing hands was mittens made of wool. Unshapely, incredibly flammable, and slightly damp from last night's stew fumes, they were nonetheless cherished. If your mittens were insulated with rabbit fur, you were either wildly resourceful or had friends in the castle kitchen. But sometimes, warmth came not from what you wore, but where you lingered. Medieval guards developed a sixth sense for tracking the hottest spots in the coldest places. A favourite among the slyer lads, standing guard over the castle's bakehouse, not because the walls were in need of particularly vigilant defending, but because the bread ovens radiated the kind of cosy glow that could toast even the frostiest pair of toes. Of course, one couldn't simply abandon a post on the outer wall to slink down to the kitchen every time their ears got cold. No, that would have been unseemly. Instead, guards became masters of creative patrol routes. For every 3 loops around the perimeter, there was one strategic pause near the latrine fire. Yes, even chamber pot fires were a hot commodity, pun shamefully intended. While the latrine fire wasn't the height of luxury, it was, shall we say, relatively warm and unoccupied, likely because no one enjoyed the scent of singed sewage with their shift. Then there was the wisdom passed down from the oldest guard in the tower, the man whose eyebrows had long ago fled in horror from permanent exposure to soot. He whispered tales of the double sock method, of hiding heated stones in a leather pouch under your tunic, and of rubbing raw onions on your feet to drive the cold away. Now, please do not try that last one at home. The heated stones, however, were especially clever, gathered from the hearth, then wrapped in wool or linen, and tucked close to the body. They lost heat quickly, but offered a few fleeting precious moments of bliss. Only problem was, if your stone slipped from its cloth wrapper mid-watch, you'd suddenly find out what 140-degree granite felt like on your inner thigh. Warmth, yes. Restful, no. And when all else failed, the guards turned to the noblest method, shivering together. Huddled patrols shoulder to shoulder, whispering complaints about the wind or the unfair rotation schedule, created a kind of camaraderie built not just on duty, but on the universal experience of being utterly, gloriously cold. In truth, the trick to surviving a medieval winter night in an icy, unheated stone fortress wasn't a single clever gadget or enchanted mitten. Though, wouldn't that have been nice? It was a slow accumulation of layered fabric, shared body heat, quick stops by heat sources just shy of being illegal, and above all else, the eternal hope that the sun would rise a little faster this time. And when the dawn did break, casting gentle peach-coloured light over the grey castle walls, you could almost forget how you hadn't felt your feet in 3 hours. Almost. Next, imagine what it was like back inside those drafty stone rooms, where tapestries whispered like ghosts and fireplaces flickered feebly against the cold. While most of the castle guards had adapted to wearing enough wool to make a sheep blush, there was one place in medieval fortifications that made even the hardiest soldier question his life choices during winter: the watchtower. Ah yes, the high and noble perch of round-the-clock vigilance, where guards kept eyes peeled for bandits, messengers, or, on particularly quiet nights, a distant bird carrying a suspiciously large twig. The problem with having the best view? It came with the worst breeze. Wind found its way into every crevice of those stone towers like a nosy aunt at a family reunion. And insulation? Well, back in the 13th century, walls were thick, but they didn't know the first thing about double glazing. So how did these human icicles stay warm up there? Well, it began with something that medieval guards knew well. Layers. Lots of them. A guard's wardrobe in winter resembled an onion. 6 layers deep and guaranteed to make you weep if you had to strip down for nature's call. Underneath the usual woolen tunics and linen shifts, guards often stuffed extra straw between their garments, effectively making themselves wearable hay bales with swords. What's remarkable is that straw, yes, the same stuff you'd bed your goat with, was one of the go-to insulators of the period. It trapped heat, was readily available, and had the bonus effect of discouraging close contact with anyone not similarly fragranced. A straw-stuffed cloak wasn't exactly elegant, but it was warm, and fashion was rarely a concern when your breath was fogging up your helmet. And then there was the brazier. Imagine a small iron cauldron-like contraption full of glowing coals, which guards kept cautiously in the watchtowers. These braziers were a boon and a menace. Warming hands one moment, singeing eyebrows the next. You had to maintain a delicate dance around them. Too close and your tunic caught fire. Too far and your toes turned to icicles. The positioning of these fiery companions required a finesse rarely taught in night school. Ideally, you'd perch just so, warming one side of your body while mentally preparing to rotate like a human spit roast. This guard rotisserie technique was passed down informally, from one frostbitten veteran to the next, and over time, perfected into something that looked vaguely like interpretive dance performed by very, very tired people. To keep the chill at bay, guards often relied on hot drinks too. Not tea, of course, not in Europe, not yet, but things like mulled wine or warm ale, sometimes spiced with cloves or herbs. Was it for heat or morale? Likely both. A warm drink in a cold tower could do wonders for the spirit, and just enough for the circulation, though it did complicate life when one's bladder suddenly protested against all those warming intentions. Stories also played their part. Huddled together during the worst of winter storms, guards often passed the time not just in shifts, but in tales, ghost stories, soldiers' gossip, or exaggerated accounts of that one time someone spotted a fox near the moat. Laughter, especially the deep, wheezy kind that comes from sheer fatigue, was remarkably warming, even if it didn't do much for your fingers. Now and then, some castles would allow soft furnishings to be brought up to the towers. Rags, old cloaks, or retired curtains nailed across narrow slits helped block howling wind from the worst directions. These odd patchworks gave some towers the curious look of an elderly dragon who'd started hoarding upholstery instead of gold. Still, when it came down to it, staying warm was less about dignity and more about survival. And for the most frigid nights, companions were sometimes the answer. Not scandalous companions, no, though castle life had its fair share of gossip, but dogs. Castle dogs, particularly shaggy, loyal ones, were known to sneak into towers to curl up beside guards. Their warm flanks and steady breaths added not just bodily heat, but a comforting presence. There's even record of one particularly beloved mastiff in 14th century Normandy who was appointed honorary night watch, though he mostly contributed via naps and drool. So the lonely, shivery heights of those medieval watchtowers weren't quite as grim as they might seem. With wool, coals, and camaraderie, the guards endured, often grumbling, occasionally roasting their shoes, but enduring all the same. Now, while the towers bore the brunt of winter's wrath, they weren't the only challenge. There were long hallways too, those echoing arteries of stone that seemed to breathe cold into your very bones. But how, you might ask, did one walk those halls in the dead of winter without turning into an icicle in motion? Well, that's a tale that takes us down a drafty corridor of its own. As the sun ducked behind a snarling curtain of winter clouds, and the wind whipped across the crenellations like a disapproving ghost with a flair for drama, the guards of a medieval castle had one singular, unrelenting query on their frostbitten minds. Why on earth did I agree to night shift? You see, winter wasn't just a gentle flurry of snow settling on turrets like powdered sugar on gingerbread. It was biting, piercing. At times, it felt like the wind itself had teeth and a personal vendetta against anyone posted on the northern tower. But guards still had to guard, burglars still had to burgle, and royal chickens still needed protecting, frostbite or not. So how did those poor sentinels stay warm? Well, by any means necessary, and often with a degree of creativity that would make a modern DIY YouTuber pause politely and say, bold choice. First came the layering. Oh, the glorious, itchy art of layering. A typical guard would pile on a linen shirt, a thick woolen tunic, another woolen tunic made of slightly older, smellier wool, a surcoat, a tabard, possibly another tabard for good luck, and then some kind of quilted gambeson that doubled as body armor and portable bedding. By the time they were fully wrapped, many resembled stuffed couch cushions with a helmet. Despite this textile fortification, extremities remained a sore point, literally. Hands and feet were the bane of every winter guard. Wool mittens helped, though they reduced sword-wielding precision to something resembling an angry swan flapping in the rain. Socks were common, often made from wool stuffed with straw or fur, depending on budget and proximity to dead animals. For particularly frugal castles, guards were told to just move their toes a lot, a tactic that works slightly better than freezing to death. Helmets, you might think, would offer some insulating advantage. Alas, most were made of cold iron, excellent for deflecting arrows, but roughly the same temperature as a witch's handshake by midnight. Some guards lined the interiors with bits of fur, cloth, or whatever the local mice weren't using. Others wore hoods beneath their helms, walking a delicate line between warm and cannot see a thing. And then there were the warming methods that verged on harebrained brilliance. In certain castles, guards would alternate shifts by the brazier, a large open pan of glowing coals placed strategically near inner wall stations. These braziers were both a blessing and a minor hazard, offering a cozy warmth and the sudden thrill of setting one's foot wraps alight. many a guard earned the nickname Singed Toes, which in those days counted as camaraderie. Arl also made an enthusiastic appearance on chilly nights, not for inebriation. Well, not just for inebriation, but because a belly full of spiced warm mead could temporarily lure a man into believing he still possessed toes. Guard stations sometimes shared a communal mug that passed from hand to wool-shrouded hand like a sacred relic, albeit one that tasted faintly of everyone. And of course, there were warming stones. Heated in hearths and then wrapped in cloth, these stones could be slipped beneath cloaks or stuffed into boots. They provided a gentle radiating heat and occasionally a prompt lesson in thermal misjudgment. A poorly wrapped stone might sear a thigh, leading to hasty hopping and a fair bit of swearing, though muffled, out of respect for the Lord's tapestry. Occupational snuggling also deserves mention. Guards assigned to watch in tandem might, though they'd never admit it, huddle close out of tactical necessity. One makes an excellent human windbreak after all, especially if they're slightly taller and already resigned to frostbite. Medieval masculinity was flexible when temperatures dropped below freezing, and everyone smelled approximately the same. For the most weather-tattered of guards, the veterans of many winters, the trick was largely mental. They muttered mantras like, "At least the enemies are colder," and fantasized about being reassigned to the castle kitchens, where the fires never went out, and there was always the chance of a rogue meat pie needing protection. So, they endured. Through icy rain and howling wind, guards clanked and shivered their way through the endless whispering nights. Wrapped in wool, dreams, and vague regrets, they kept their watch. Sometimes warm, sometimes frozen solid to the parapet, like noble icicle sculptures in chainmail. And yet, in their bones, they knew the cold couldn't last forever, that the sun would rise, and with it, perhaps a hot turnip stew, a new pair of mittens, or a small, miraculous fire in the guardhouse hearth. But before we follow the sun's golden yawn across the ramparts, let's linger a moment longer in the shadowed corridors of stone, where something curious stirs within the castle walls. It was in the still, dark corners of the castle that the true battlefield of winter was fought. You see, while the grand halls occasionally saw a spark of firelight or the wafting scent of mulled wine among the nobility, the average guard posted in an outer corridor was battling not dragons nor marauders, but rather the persistent sting of a medieval draft. Let us consider the tower watchman. One might imagine this job involved a fair bit of heroic gazing into the misty distance, perhaps while holding a torch and frowning meaningfully. In truth, it mostly consisted of shivering while trying not to get frostbite on one's nose. Medieval towers were not insulated for comfort. In fact, they weren't insulated at all. The stone walls, while excellent at repelling enemies and modelling damp moss, were also enthusiastic conductors of cold. So how then did our steely-eyed sentries survive the slipperiest of seasons? The answer begins, ever humbly, with the humble cloak. Wool was winter's first and most faithful ally. A properly thick woolen cloak, often layered and pinned securely with a brooch, forged by someone's uncle's cousin who used to be a farrier, could trap body heat like a miracle straight from St. Bridget herself. Guards would wrap themselves in multiple layers of woolen tunics, sometimes even repurposing old blankets, when the castle budget leaned more toward the siege preparation side than employee satisfaction. Underneath these garments, the guards wore linen. While not luxurious, linen kept perspiration away from the skin, which was useful if you had to pace back and forth up a guard tower in the middle of a hailstorm while wondering when your shift would end and whether your toes were still technically attached. Now, your more fortunate guards might be issued fur. Not the glamorous sort of fur that came with smug, aristocratic chin, tilts, but the scruffier, peasant-grade variety. Rabbit fur, oftentimes. Cozy, if acquired legally. Slightly bloodier if not. Furs were typically lined inside cloaks and gloves, and guards wore fur mittens that could double as squirrel-sized ovens for their fingers. Speaking of fingers, we mustn't overlook the ingenious strategy known as the hot turnip. Yes, truly. Cooking fires were rarely allowed near wooden ramparts, what with the whole risk of burning down your only line of defense concern. But within the guard room, or sometimes just below the battlements, turnips, or occasionally stones, were heated by the hearth and wrapped in cloth. These steaming vegetables were then handed to guards, who clutched them like medieval hand warmers. Occasionally, in a moment of fatigue or hunger, the hand warmer turned snack, and another turnip had to be called in from the reserves. And then there were the boots. Oh, the boots of yore, stiff as stale bread, but far more expensive. Medieval footwear was not known for its arch support, but guard boots often came with stuffing, moss, straw, and even shredded cloth tucked inside to keep the cold from sneaking in. This approach was known not as insulation, but rather as, well, it's better than frostbite. Some creative souls, unable to afford fur or decent boots, took to wrapping their legs in bandages. These were known as puttees or winningers, and they functioned both as mild insulation and as an early form of leg day at the gym, what with all the awkward uphill pacing involved. And let us not forget the mental tricks, essential for enduring a twilight shift with only snowflakes and ravens for company. Guards would tell stories, hum tunes, or recite inventories of livestock from memory, just to keep their minds sharp and not accidentally become part of the snowdrift. A knight once claimed he got through one particularly brutal January night by pretending his cloak was a dragon's wing, and that he, the noble dragon keeper, must not fall asleep, lest the beast fly off and marry his cousin. If none of that worked, there was the classic method, subtle pacing. Round and round the tower, walking tight laps to circulate blood, and icily whisper curses against the day the steward posted you to door duty. You had to do it just slowly enough so the noise didn't wake light-sleeping nobles below. There's probably a poem about that somewhere. In short, castle guards became winter's quiet warriors. They didn't wear shining armor or wield flaming swords. They wielded cabbage stew farts and patchy mittens, and the kind of bitter determination that's born only when the wind slaps you in the face and calls it Tuesday. The frozen walls of the kingdom were kept safe not by magic or might, but by a rotating schedule of weary men, boiled root vegetables, and a rather passionate grudge against icicles. And speaking of rotations, soon enough, one guard would come to relieve the next. But what did that handoff look like exactly? What silent rituals passed between the outgoing and the incoming, as day turned to dusk in the land of drafty stone? The bitter bite of a medieval winter pressed its icy fingers into every crack of a stone castle. Wind howled through arrow slits like a ghost that had clearly skipped choir practice, and drafty corridors seemed custom designed to encourage shivering. Yet there they stood, castle guards, layered in boiled wool, leather, and the occasional fur, bravely facing the cold with expressions that said, "My toes, never heard of them." By this point, in the long nights of a 13th century frost, guards had learned not to expect warmth, but to chase it in creative and often questionable ways. One such marvel of medieval ingenuity was the Hand warmer brick. Chunks of heated stone carried from the kitchen hearth, wrapped in coarse cloth, and tucked beneath cloaks or under benches. A glorious few lucky guards were stationed near the kitchen itself, the ultimate winter assignment. Not for the smell of roasting meat or the proximity to tasty crumbs, although those were bonuses, but because the ovens radiated a rude and glorious heat that could make even a chainmail-clad footman feel briefly human. But for those less fortunate, for instance, the fellow atop the wind-jostled North Tower, heat was a dream best told through clenched teeth and frozen eyelids. To fight the cold, guards developed rituals, what we today might call coping mechanisms, but with more wool mittens and fewer emotional support cats. One such practice was warming the bones, a delightful euphemism for stomping in place, slapping thighs, and humming half-frozen tavern songs to get the blood flowing just enough to avoid resembling a decorative gargoyle. And speaking of bones, there is some archaeological evidence that guards, and indeed other castle dwellers, would drink bone broth or spiced ale to heat themselves from the inside out. The bone broth was prepared in great simmering cauldrons, dense and steaming, a medieval answer to modern soup cravings. Warm, salty, and full of minerals, it was a potion for perseverance, helping stalwart sentries keep both their limbs and their loyalty intact. Of course, even the most nutritious ladleful could not thaw out chainmail. By design, armor was excellent for deflecting arrows, but dreadful at keeping out winter's whisper. So guards draped themselves in padded gambesons, thick, quilted tunics that looked suspiciously like oversized potholders, because frankly, that's what they were. Layers were key. A guard might wear a linen shirt, a wool tunic, then a gambeson, then armor, then a fur-trimmed cloak. Fashionable, perhaps not. Functional, arguably. Cozy? Only if you ignored the constant itch and the looming threat of dampness. Some clever castles, particularly those with wealth and the architectural foresight of one who dislikes frozen eyebrows, included what were called wall flues, special hollow channels behind walls that could carry warm air from fireplaces below up into guard rooms. These were rare, luxurious signs that someone, somewhere in the draft-riddled hierarchy of medieval architecture, believed guards deserved warm joints. Most nobles did not share this conviction, unless bribed with venison. And what of mittens, you ask? Ah, yes, the underappreciated medieval mitt. While gloves existed, they were expensive and often reserved for the upper crust, both the bread and the aristocracy. Guards were more likely to use fingerless mitts or crude leather wraps. They needed their fingers when patrolling with torches or ringing cold bells to signal an incoming raid, or worse, a wandering goat. Never underestimate the midnight goat panic. Some stations, particularly those carved into outer walls, had guard holes, tiny alcoves barely large enough to fit a man, designed to shield watchmen from direct wind, but offering no illusions of warmth. Guards would wedge inside, knees to chins, and pass the hours blowing warm air into their sleeves and regretting most life choices that led them there. But let us not forget the bonding power of communal suffering. Guards on long, frigid shifts often shared jokes, whispered tales, or passed flasks hidden in boots. They learned each other's shivers, like an odd winter symphony of rattling teeth and muffled curses. It was cold, yes, but enduring it together formed camaraderie that no embroidery circle or minstrel song could ever quite capture. Beneath all the iron and frost, the castle guard remained a figure of quiet resilience. As his breath fogged into the night air, He stood vigilant against raiders, snow, and sheep alike. Somewhere behind him, the gentle shimmer of coals glowed beneath a soup pot, a flicker of warmth he'd dream of until his next shift. And beyond the frostbitten battlements, another kind of cold was creeping through medieval life, one not found in the wind or stone, but in the very tools meant to bring warmth. While most castle guards of winter nights dreamt longingly of fireside glory, the truth was considerably less toasty. Picture a world where central heating was still, regrettably, several plagues and a few beheadings away, where a frosty draught wasn't just a passing discomfort, but a loyal companion threading its way through every stone corridor and chainmail crevice. Now, when evening fell over a medieval stronghold, the shadows lengthened, the torches flickered, and the cold crept in like an overdue tax collector, persistent, unwelcome, and ready to take your warmth without remorse. Guards stationed atop the battlements, brave souls with names like Wulfgar, Egbert, or Dave from the Outer Manor, wrapped themselves in every layer they could muster. Think of them less like soldiers and more like medieval onions, swaddled in woolen tunics, undercloaks of coarse linen, hose, and perhaps, if they were lucky, a shaggy outer mantle made from sheepskin, goat pelt, or their retired great-aunt's curtains. Vanity was not a luxury afforded to the frostbitten, but the cold was clever. It crawled through the seams, kissed the fingers, and invaded socks woven a month too thin. Guards developed little tricks, small rituals like swinging their arms in rhythmic arcs, hopping from one foot to the other like enthusiastic jugglers just off stage, or muttering low chants whose magical function was roughly complain and hope. One practiced technique, not listed in any formal knightly manual, was the castle saunter. This involved a pacing circuit back and forth along the ramparts. Not only did it keep blood moving grudgingly through limbs, it also allowed for ample gossip. And gossip, as anyone who's ever laboured through a long winter shift knows, is the coal that keeps the conversational furnace burning. Did Sir Godfrey really eat 16 pickled parsnips? Was Lady Margaret's new headdress fashioned from curtains, or from the sheep who ate the curtains? Of course, one could also slide into the unspoken traditions of shift sharing. Medieval guards were not clock watchers. There were no clocks, but they understood fairness. A night was long. Irony had it that castle towers often had small hearths built within, but these were frequently reserved for those with less risk of being pierced by an arrow or melted by a siege cauldron. But on a particularly bitter night, off-duty guards might invite their relieved comrades into a warming alcove for a fleeting sniff of firelight and a sip of something strong enough to reinforce their courage, and perhaps tickle the liver into motion for warmth. Occasionally, warmth came in unconventional forms. Castle dogs, hairy, dignified creatures of ambiguous breed, were highly valued, not just as alarm barkers, but as living heating implements. A faithful mutt curled up at your boots could make the difference between mildly frostbitten toes and singing ballads in spring. Some guards became possessive of particular hounds, pretending loyalty when really it was just strategic snuggling. Good boy had layers. On more desperate nights, guards circulated looped ropes between comrades, tugged now and then to ensure the other hadn't frozen vertically. This wasn't foolproof. Some guards were simply heavy sleepers, but the effort was there. Nobility, after all, looked rather dim when they opened the gates to find half their defence force petrified like poorly dressed statues. In some more forward-thinking garrisons, usually those under the command of a lady castellan not to be trifled with, guards were rotated frequently. 1 hour on, 1 hour near the kitchen fires watching the stew simmer. This system, naturally, encouraged prolonged stew watching and highly detailed stew critiques. It's improved since Tuesday, but the leaks don't sing like they used to. Still, the guards of the time wore their duty like their padded gambesons, stiff, uncomfortable, yet somehow noble in its own odd way. They stood watch not just against invaders, but against the slow siege of frost itself, enduring the long, blanketing winters with nothing but resolve, thick socks, and an unrestricted cannonade of muttered complaints. And somewhere beneath the snow-heavy ramparts, in the kitchens and the larders and the modest warmth of musty storerooms, another kind of war against the cold was being waged, one fought not by knights or sentinels, but by cooks and stewards with ladles, spices, and experimental trenchers. If you tiptoe into a medieval castle in the deep heart of winter, an act I recommend only in imagination given the draftiness, you might find yourself in the guardroom, a curious little space full of men in chainmail trying very hard not to shiver attractively. In theory, castle architecture was designed for defense. In practice, it frequently ignored a minor detail known as the human body's need for warmth. The walls, often the thickness of a baker's modest self-worth, were made of stone, which is excellent for stopping arrows, less so for retaining heat. You might think a roaring fire was the solution, and the guards certainly thought so too. But lighting fires inside a stone tower wasn't without its challenges. For one, medieval ventilation systems were essentially a few holes punched in unfortunate directions. Too much smoke, and the guards might stay warm but become slightly less alive, already out of commission before the enemy even reached the portcullis. So how did they keep warm? The answer, dear dreamer, is a blend of clever clothing, tactical companionship, and what we might politely call warming rituals of the creatively desperate. First came the layers. Oh, the layers. If you've ever complained about putting on 2 sweaters, imagine suiting up in a quilted gambeson, a thick padded undercoat, then wrapping yourself in a chainmail shirt, topped with your lord's favoured colours in tabard form. And beneath all that, woolen hose. Not the fragrant roses of spring, but tightly knitted wool pulled over legs with all the elegance of stuffing sausage casings. Layer upon itchy layer, designed to trap body heat and dignity alike somewhere in the folds. Guard shifts were often timed with nature's most well-known thermal event, sunrise. But even at night, when fingers stiffened and breath turned into white clouds, the men managed with teamwork. On especially frosty evenings, guards weren't assigned towers alone. No, that would be inhumane. They were paired off, a sort of nightly buddy system. One man might stomp around, pacing back and forth like an underqualified philosopher trying to warm his boots through kinetic despair, while the other huddled near a brazier. Those marvellous medieval buckets of burning coals. Ah, the brazier. Truly, the unsung hero of castle comfort. Simple iron baskets suspended on stands, they allowed a little controlled fire to be maintained in the watch stations. Coals would be stolen, borrowed really, from the main hearths in the great hall. You can almost see it now. A guard sprinting through the corridors with a glowing shovel, muttering apologies to the cook, trailing embers like some kind of rebellious firefly. Of course, fuel was precious. Firewood in winter was guarded almost as fiercely as the wine cellar. The result? Guards became fuel miser virtuosos. They learned to feed the brazier slowly, coaxing flame from embers like a court poet coaxing favour from a noble with deep pockets and shallow patience. Then there were the warm drinks. not just for nobles sipping spiced wine. Even humble guards indulged when fortune allowed. However, they weren't savouring marshmallow-laced cocoa. More likely, it was a warm trench cider, or ale heated by plunging a hot poker into the mug for a bit of theatrical sizzle and sudden steam. It may not have been fine dining, but when your toes are beginning to resemble cold, damp biscuits, even a mug of mead that tastes like smelly bread can feel like a miracle. And when liquids ran low and braziers waned with sparseness, well, there was huddling. Yes, even the most stoic knight might shuffle a bit closer to his comrade, muttering something gruff about strategic body heat placement, while pretending they weren't basically spooning under a shared wool blanket. Camaraderie, after all, is best served warm. If all else failed, a rotating guard schedule, often hourly or every other hour, allowed for reprieves. 1 hour freezing to the marrow on the battlement, then an hour curled up on a rough wooden bench near the kitchens in what passed for a slumber. Which brings us gently to our next dreamy curiosity, the castle kitchens, where heat was not just a blessing, but a weapon of survival for both bread and bodies. While the nobles huddled near roaring hearths that crackled with imported hardwood, and castle kitchens radiated the steam of stews that would challenge even the most stoic sauna, the guards, yes, the ever-watchful, ever-sniffling guardians of stone and duty, had no such luxuries. Their beat took them from drafty turrets to wind-whipped gatehouses, oftentimes miles, emotionally, from the nearest fire. And so, left to their own frozen devices, castle guards cobbled together a rather impressive, if not slightly comedic repertoire of tactics to stay warm. Imagine them as medieval Boy Scouts with spears, neck-deep in wool strategies and passive grumbling. First, there was the sacred art of the layer. No self-respecting guard faced a January dawn without piling on various scraps of linen, woolen tunics, padded gambesons, and, if they had won the militia lotto, a slightly moth-eaten cloak of sheepskin. Nakedness beneath armour, a myth spread by romantic poets who clearly never stood butt first to a Scottish wind. Wool, of course, was the king of the castle, and not the romantic, leafy Pinterest kind of wool. This stuff was coarse, rugged, and often housed a permanent population of mystery fibres and the spirit of damp. But it did the trick. Wool's fibres trap warm air gloriously, and when you're clinging numbly to a frosted parapet at midnight, your standards aren't all that high. Now, some guards swore by the hot stone trick. Before their shift, they'd beg a kitchen servant, or blacksmith, depending on desperation, to give them a warmed cobblestone, tenderly heated in the fire until it possessed the soul of a volcano. Wrapped in cloth and tucked in a belt pouch or under the armpit, it was medieval central heating with a portability rating of 2 out of 10. The downside, drop it, and your future children might hear the scream echo through their dreams. Others developed the fine skill of strategic pacing, a sort of glorified marching in place that turned patrol routes into cardio circuits. Up the west battlement, down the gatehouse stairs, through the side hall of haunted Geoffrey's old room, and back again. Rhythmic, vaguely purposeful, and, most importantly, warmth-producing. Well, warmth in the relative sense. Like how a candle could, if you squinted, resemble the sun. Then there were the buddy systems, a practice as old as frostbite itself. Guards assigned to towers would frequently post in pairs not just for safety, but for the time-honoured sport of share the cloak. This technique involved draping a single large woolen cloak around 2 shivering men as they attempted to remain stoic, while basically spooning like frostbitten spoons. Experts in medieval etiquette would call it manly thermal proximity. In some castles, they even had what's affectionately known among historical oddities as guardroom snugs. Tiny chamber pockets, burrowed strategically into thick stone walls and vaguely resembling bread ovens. These nooks would contain a brazier or torches. Mostly, they smoked a lot and singed eyebrows, but guards would flock to them like moths that weren't particularly worried about lung health. And of course, a wee tipple didn't hurt. It's documented, unofficially, and perhaps only in the footnotes written in spilt ink and mischief, that guards might keep a flask of something motivational tucked into their cloak folds. Mead, ale, that inexplicable herbal liquor Brother Thomas started brewing during his solitary year, warming the belly, if not the judgment. 1 gulp for bravery, 2 for warmth, 3, and you're asking the weather politely to be reasonable. Still, for all these techniques, the layers, the stones, the unspoken gentleman's agreement to huddle like coal penguins, there was one thing truly keeping these medieval guards going through endless, snow-swept vigils. Gossip. Oh, the talking. About who sneezed in front of the Baron last Tuesday, whether Gertrude the cook is romantically linked to Sir Bertram. Nobody believed it, but repeating it helped you forget frostbite. Or whether that odd whistling in the upper tower was ghosts or just the wind through Louis's nose. Because warmth, they learned, wasn't always about fire or fur. Sometimes it was stitched out of shared stories, overheard rumours, and recited tales that made the night march a little quicker and the shadows a little less sharp. And if you tilted your ear just right, you could almost hear them, chuckling through chattering teeth next to the fireless gate, trading tales to stay awake and stay together. Now, speaking of fires and tales, there's something curious about castle fireplaces. Those enormous, black-mouthed beasts carved into walls like stone dragons, but their smoke had secrets, and sometimes it got trapped. But that's a warm, sooty mystery for another dreamy moment. There were few things more motivating than coal creeping steadily up your pant leg while you tried to maintain the stoic dignity of a royal guardsman. And yet, amid the frostbitten dignity and endless wind-whistling watchtower shifts, castle guards of the medieval age managed their chill in some rather imaginative ways. Let us descend tonight into the sleepy tale of the guard's greatest treasure, ingenuity born of desperation, and the slow, creeping frostbite of the left buttock. First, layers. You might expect that medieval guards simply wore thick coats, but why stop at 1 when you can wear 5? Beneath their chainmail and tunics, many guards stuffed themselves into what we shall call 12th century thermal couture, homespun woolen undergarments, layered linen shirts, and more fur than your average woodland creature. Wool was queen here, reigning supreme over goosebumps. Breathable, moisture-wicking, and only mildly itchy, it was their best friend in winter gloom. But warmth had a price. Namely, the occasional struggle to bend at the knees during battle. And then there were what they fondly called hose. No, not the plastic kind that coil in modern-day garages, but fitted woolen leggings that hugged the legs like an affectionate, slightly damp ferret. Add to that soft leather boots lined with straw or moss, and voila, at least 2 out of 10 toes would survive the season. In some castles, guards would also be issued cloaks so voluminous they might have been mistaken for sails. These heavy, fur-lined capes could be worn, thrown over shoulders dramatically during a siege, or even tucked over the nose for an emergency winter nap while no one was watching. Multi-purpose fashion at its finest. But naturally, Blankets can only go so far when your post is a stone parapet absorbing December winds like a giant freezing sponge. So creative measures were taken. One particularly beloved warmth spreader was the humble brazier, an open metal container, often resembling a miniature barbecue, minus the burgers, lit with glowing coals and fed a diet of twigs, peat, or dried manure. Yes, you heard correctly. It emitted enough heat to toast the inside of one's gloves without burning off the eyebrows. You just had to keep your cloak from billowing into the flames, an unfortunate occurrence that led to several abrupt fashion changes and at least one guard being remembered in eternal tavern song, as singed Bogdan. Guards posted outside often huddled for warmth, in small groups that resembled the start of a rugby scrum or a failed attempt at interpretive dance. Officially, they were keeping a sharp lookout on all fronts. Unofficially, they were squeezing together like dumplings in a very large and historically accurate soup. Some castles allowed shift to rotate frequently, guard 1 hour, drink broth the next. The broth, by the way, was far from glamorous. Imagine a lukewarm mixture of turnips, salty water, and mysterious floating things that may once have been onions. But it was hot, and that was all that mattered. Some even swore it helped you feel your toes again. Others just lost feeling entirely and claimed spiritual enlightenment. As for bedtime, when guards were finally off duty, and crawling into the closet-sized bedchambers tucked between stone staircases and draft tunnels, they had one priority: body heat. The medieval knapsack often involved sharing straw mattresses, itchy wool blankets, and complaining rights. Snoozing near the kitchen hearth was the golden ticket, but sleeping over the stables was a close second. Livestock generate quite a lot of heat, and cows rarely objected to snoring. But perhaps the oddest solution of all was a recipe some guards swore by: warm ale laced with ginger and pepper. Known as a poor man's posset, it didn't taste particularly nice and had the texture of regret, but it certainly set one's insides buzzing, at least until you remembered you'd have to climb the outer wall again in 6 hours. And so, amid the swirling winds and stone-cold sentry duty, medieval guards learned the art of persistence wrapped in wool and roasted by braziers. They did not have heat packs or weatherproof boots, but they had each other, thermal cloaks, and mugs of something hot enough to classify as both beverage and weapon. Soon, we'll explore another peculiar solution to castle winter life. One that involved less layering, more licking. But that story waits for just a little longer, until the next sleepy turn in our tale. They say that silence speaks volumes, and nowhere was that more true than in the castle's high watchtower just before dawn. Frost laced the arrow slits like delicate spiderwebs spun by some ice-loving artisan, and the world outside, trees, fields, and distant sheep-shaped fluff bundles, was wrapped in a white whisper of snow. Inside, though, the silence was very much alive, mostly with the sound of guard Thaddeus trying not to sneeze. It was the hour before changing of the watch, a curious time when fingers have forgotten warmth and even boredom feels frosted over. This was the colder clock, as many a bleary-eyed castle guard dubbed it, usually accompanied by the kind of muttering that only long exposure to coalstone could inspire. And yet, in this quiet, frigid hour, something remarkable often happened. No, nothing heroic like slaying dragons or deterring invaders, something far nobler: the brewing of guard broth. Now, let's not pretend this was an actual recipe endorsed by castle chefs. Guard broth was what you got when a desperate soldier took whatever he could. In Thaddeus's case, crushed garlic, an old onion, a regrettably dry hunk of cheese, and a pinch of optimism, and chucked it into boiling water perched atop the lookout's tiny ember-fed brazier. Because yes, even in medieval times, nothing said surviving another freezing watch quite like improvisational soup. The brazier itself was a humble piece of medieval engineering. Imagine a small iron basket, elevated on legs, filled with glowing coals and dreams of summer. Sentries huddled around it like medieval moths to a feeble, legal fire. And while safety protocols were less than modern, medieval fire extinguishers famously amounted to throw snow on it and hope. The brazier was essential. It provided heat, light, and a communal hub for guards to exchange gripes about the weather, rumours about the Lord's new falcon, and updates on whose boots currently had the best straw insulation. Straw, mind you, was the unsung hero of medieval fashion. If you peeled back the layers of a watchman's attire, you'd find not just coarse wool and the occasional sheepskin cape, but bundles of straw carefully tucked into boots, sleeves, and every available hollow. It crackled with each movement, which made stealth somewhat aspirational. But when temperatures dropped below coatless peasant, straw was the difference between frostbite and functioning knees. Some guards swore by fur-lined capes, but that depended on your lord's generosity, your station rank, or your willingness to borrow gear that technically belonged to the hunting master. Others layered so thoroughly they waddled like overstuffed hedgehogs, more cloth than man. And then there were Thaddeus's mittens, noble lumps of felted wool sewn together by someone who, judging by the crookedness, had either never seen hands or found fingers conceptually confusing. The mittens barely fit, but they were loved. They had survived 3 winters, 1 petulant goat attack, and an unfortunate incident involving spilled mead and a panicked duck. In the cold tower, they were the last line of defense between Thaddeus's dignity and rapidly pinkening fingers. To pass the time during endless hours of nothing happening, which was also, by definition, a resounding success for castle security, guards often turned to storytelling. One particularly enduring tale was the legend of the Smoking Knight, a ghostly figure who, according to local lore, had discovered the perfect method to stay warm, involving a soup kettle, a squirrel pelt, and 3 mysterious scarves. No one agreed on the ending, but everyone agreed it was absolutely, definitely true, and almost certainly someone's cousin had seen him once, just beyond the battlements after midnight. Laughter and tall tales did more than distract, it warmed. There's a particular kind of heat that comes from shared stories and the camaraderie of chilly comrades, a gentle flame that flickers somewhere between your ribs and your resolve. And so it was that as the fire whispered low and the broth full of questionable ingredients threatened to congeal, Thaddeus looked out over the snow-blanketed village below and smiled. The air was still, the sky tinged with the very first blush of morning. Somewhere below, a rooster wouldn't crow for another few minutes. The warmth was kindled not in his soup, but in the quiet loyalty of the watch, the haphazard defences of straw, mittens and firelight, and the brave conviction that dawn would indeed come, probably with porridge. Soon, the slow shuffle of boots on stone would announce the arrival of the next shift. But before that could happen, something peculiar stirred within the castle walls. An age-old ritual known to tower guards far and wide, whispered only on the coldest nights. The sacred, eternal quest for a better place to nap. When winter settled in with a frosty sigh and turned the high towers of medieval castles into vertical iceboxes, some of the more desperate guards turned to a curious ancient strategy that had existed long before thermostats, long johns, or even the concept of central heating, sharing body heat. Yes, dear listener, it is time to speak, very respectfully, of the nearly forgotten but undeniably practical tradition of the castle guard cuddle. Now, before your imagination runs leaping through tapestries, let me assure you, we are not venturing into scandalous territory. This was strictly utilitarian. When you're posted atop a wind-flayed rampart at 2 a.m, with the sort of cold that seeps into your soul and forgets how to leave, clinging to a fellow shivering knight wasn't sentimental. It was survival. Guards often took overnight shifts in pairs, not because they enjoyed each other's stories, although Sir Ethelbert did have a very entertaining theory about geese being agents of the devil, but because 2 semi-frozen guards pressed together under a bare fur could, with great luck and even greater layers, stave off hypothermia. Think of them as medieval penguins, stoically huddling through the night. Even the Germans had a wonderfully sturdy word for it, Kälteschutzkompanie, roughly translating to cold protection comradeship. Though some scholars debate whether this was ever officially Latinized, one cannot help but imagine a monk somewhere, shivering by candlelight, carefully copying down both Homer and helpful tips for human insulation. The truly elite guards, the ones stationed in royal quarters or watching high-value doors, sometimes had access to sheepskin-lined cloaks or long woolen coats, known as pelisses. These were rare treasures of the wardrobe, allocated with the same seriousness as weaponry, and like swords, they were sometimes fought over. There's a letter dated from 1382, in which a squire named Osmond requests reassignment because his coat had been requisitioned by a higher-ranked guard during a particularly icy week, leaving Osmond with naught but his honour and a damp sock. Aside from sympathetic wardrobe theft, guards got creative. They'd heat stones in the castle kitchens, huge, smooth ones the size of a good book, and wrap them in oiled leather or tow cloth. Tucked under cloaks, these primitive heat packs provided a moment of warmth, though they cooled down quickly and left a smell some described as like wet bread in a chimney. Some particularly enterprising garrisons took to making their own portable stoves. These were usually little more than a small earthen brazier or metal cup kept on a stone base, where embers could smoulder for hours. The trouble, open flames on a wooden turret deck proved, let's call it, strategically risky. Several watchtowers met their end not at the hands of enemy siege, but due to a sleepy guard knocking over a smouldering comfort pot. Safety regulations in the 1300s were, to put it gently, aspirational. But perhaps the most delightfully bizarre coal-fighting tactic involved music. Yes, strange as it sounds, guards would pass the time and warm the blood by thumping out rhythms on their armour or humming slow, droning tunes to keep their spirits up. In French garrisons, this gave rise to a tradition of winter watch songs, many of which survive only in fragments. One translated line reads, "My toes are like ghosts and my nose is a stone, but if I sing louder, I won't be alone." It's no chart topper, but perhaps it reached number 1 on the hit parade of misery. Indoor guards had it somewhat better, though indoor in a medieval keep mostly meant colder but less wind. If their station allowed, they stood near braziers or even commandeered a corner of the great hall's massive fireplace when visiting nobility weren't using it to roast something ambitious like a whole boar or a Middle French delicacy involving far too many spices and not enough vegetables. Winter fatigue was real. There's evidence from monastic records of guards being rotated more frequently during colder months, as exhaustion and chill lowered attentiveness and made hallucinations, such as thinking the family cat was an invading knight, a rather serious issue. One medieval joke book, it's truly awful, but terribly earnest, even features a tale of a guard who challenged a shadow cast by the moon and demanded that it state its business in the king's tongue. And so, winter or no, atop frostbitten parapets and stone-clad gates, the guard kept watch. Armoured in wool, warmed by stones, humming melancholic tunes to themselves and perhaps occasionally to a passing pigeon, they endured the night. But there is more to explore about how these frigid fortresses fended off the cold, particularly from below the walls. For under the castle, secrets were simmering. It may come as a surprise to discover that one of the medieval guard's most treasured allies against the cold wasn't a fur cloak or a roaring hearth, but the castle latrine. Yes, the very place you'd think to avoid when temperatures plummeted was, rather ironically, the toasty nook of last resort. Now, before your nose wrinkles in dismay, allow me to explain. Medieval castles, particularly the grander stone behemoths of the north, often had latrines built into the thick outer walls, stone shafts that dropped waist discreetly into the moat or pit below. These chutes, called garderobes, were typically placed near sleeping quarters or guard stations at strategic perches on the castle perimeter. And while their primary function was, well, obvious, their unexpected role as early medieval heating units was a quiet, deeply unsung story. You see, waste emits heat during decomposition. Not a blazing furnace by any means, but warmth enough to make a difference when your alternative was a drafty wall and a thin woolen tunic. Guards, ever masters of improvisation, would loiter just outside these steamy vertical vents, pretending very hard to be on alarmingly dedicated lookout duty. If the scent became too much, which it often did, guards might apply sprigs of fragrant herbs in their nostrils, a trick borrowed from plague doctors and overachieving monks. Lavender was a favourite, though it hardly stood a chance in February near an unemptied chute. One particularly creative castle in southern France allegedly built double-walled garderobes, not to contain royal waste more elegantly, but to create warm corridors in winter. The walls would retain the modest heat rising from the depths, offering a cosy, snaking passage where servants and slack-shift guards could shuffle through in relative comfort, looking deeply busy all the while. But when an ambitious guard could not secure latrine shelter privileges, a space fraught with territorial disputes, they might sneak away to the bakehouse. The bakehouse, now there's a gem. Warm, flour-dusted, and always smelling like yesterday's feast and tomorrow's breakfast. It was often tucked within the inner ward, near the kitchens, and gave off enough residual heat to cook gossip for hours. Of course, guards technically weren't supposed to be wandering into bakehouses mid-patrol, but give a devoted night watchman 6 hours of moated frostbite and a compelling enough lie, I thought I heard a suspicious scone rustling down here, and he might earn an oatcake and 15 minutes next to the oven's brick belly. For those truly determined to outwit the cold while staying in place, there was always the option of the hot pebble trick. Find a smooth palm-sized stone, soak it in near boiling water, and tuck it inside your gloves or under your tunic. A trick as old as discomfort itself. The warmth lasted not long enough, but long enough to remember what fingers are supposed to feel like. In dire straits, guards got creative with rhythm, marching in place, swinging their arms, performing what contemporary scholars might call the medieval Macarena, but with less joy, more creaking joints, and hazardous chainmail clinking. And in some forward-thinking strongholds, commanders issued a rotating warming hour. While one guard froze stoically beside the parapet, the other lounged next to the kitchen spit-turner. Hour by hour, like frosty clockwork, they'd switch. Though the fairness of this system heavily depended on whether the officer was paying attention or had wandered off to court the mead stewardess again. Even the watchdogs, those noble, shaggy companions of the night, offered heat, not only by curling up beside guards, but sometimes flat out sitting on their feet with determined canine loyalty. In truth, many a guard's dignity fell gladly beneath a Labrador's posterior if it meant the blessed delivery of warm toes. And so, in the grand freezing theatre of castle life, against snow-crusted battlements and beneath drifts that settled like defeated silk on stone, the medieval night guard endured. Not stoically, as romantic songs would later claim, but resourcefully, exasperatedly, and always with one eye on the nearest chimney. The night lingers ever on in the medieval world, and somewhere beyond the ramparts, a new trick is about to flicker from the embers of necessity. In the quiet heart of a medieval winter's night, when the moon hung like a silver coin tossed into a frozen well, some poor soul had to patrol the castle walls. Yes, while nobles snored beneath heavy woolen blankets and fire-roaring hearths, a castle guard's lot was considerably less luxurious. But those brave, or perhaps simply assigned, souls didn't simply stand there frozen solid, like slightly frowny icicles. No, they had tricks up their fur-lined sleeves. Let's begin with something delightfully medieval and perennially dependable. Layers, a castle guard in winter dressed like an onion with commitment issues. First came the base layer, a trusty linen shirt, depending on status perhaps not washed since St. Swithin's Day. On top of that, thick woolen tunics, the medieval equivalent of thermal underwear, albeit itchier. Then came a surcoat or gambeson, thickly padded and perfect both for warmth and for absorbing the occasional stray arrow, and if they were lucky, a fur-lined cloak wrapped and pinned dramatically over one shoulder, giving them the appearance of being halfway to a royal portrait, halfway to freezing. But clothing was just the start. Warmth was treated as a strategy, not a condition expected from the universe. Guards took to their shifts, rotating regularly, allowing the most frostbitten among them to retreat to the castle's few warm spaces. Often the gatehouse, or a brazier-lit corner of the courtyard armory, where a fire might smoulder grumpily, pretending to help. Now, speaking of braziers, the medieval space heaters of their time. These little iron or clay baskets on legs burned charcoal or wood and were strategically placed around castle interiors. Guards would huddle near them during breaks, souls thawing out like bread left near a sunny window, their faces flushed a splotchy pink, fingers poking into the firelight to remind themselves of what warmth felt like. Of course, these fires weren't always optimally located, unless you enjoyed standing in drafty alcoves with a red-hot cauldron of embers between your boots. Some castle architects tried to address the chill through design, with varying degrees of success. The spiral staircases inside towers, often built clockwise for defensive reasons, had the delightful secondary effect of channeling wind like a well-weaponized canyon. Guards trudging these stairs could either freeze slowly or race up them and warm themselves by sheer aerobic activity. It wasn't all drear and chill, though. Guards had each other, and with companionship came shared flasks of whatever counted as warming drink that week. Often, it was warmed ale, mead, or, when spirits were really required, fortified wine. These were consumed discreetly, of course. Officially, one did not drink on duty. Unofficially, castle sentries developed an instinctual ability to sip mulled ale and keep an eye out for unexpected visitors. And then there were the forgotten heroes of keeping warm: animals. The lucky man stationed in the stables, a veritable sauna by medieval standards. Straw insulation, walls sheltered from the prevailing wind, and most importantly, the gently steaming bodies of horses, the original organic space heaters. On especially brutal nights, guards would sneak into the stables under the noble pretense of checking the tack, but truly to bury numb fingers in horse manes and remind themselves what life before frostbite felt like. Still, nothing beats shared warmth. A tightly packed watchtower with 4 guards and no pretensions about personal space could start to feel, if not comfortable, then at least survivable. They'd trade stories, sing quietly, hum tunes about spring, and lean in close like penguins at a royal coronation. The cold was ever present, like a cautious ghost tapping at the edges of your cloak, but it could be held at bay by camaraderie, and perhaps a just barely legal firepot smuggled in under an inverted helmet. What amazes me, dear sleeper, is that through all this, the guards still watched. They stood watchful under an endless grey sky, eyes peering beyond the snowy horizon for wolves, raiders, or possibly just the welcome silhouette of the cook bringing midnight porridge. So how did they stay warm? With layers, fire, wine, clever placement, and the absolute refusal to give up their toes to the frosted gods of winter. And somewhere, footsteps crunch on icy stone, as we quietly follow one guard higher toward a terribly unheated tower where something curious awaits in the shadows. As winter howled beyond the stone walls and icicles clung to archer slits like nature's own medieval chandeliers, the guards stationed atop snowy battlements faced a chilling reality. They were now officially colder than a nun's whisper at confession. But our brave, occasionally well-padded guards weren't entirely without resources, ingenuity, or a healthy dose of grumbling. First, there was the remarkable and frequently itchy strategy of layering. If you think your uncle wears too many jackets in the winter, you haven't met a castle guard in January. Wool, linen, fur, and anything vaguely textile-like was considered fair game. Some wore so many garments that putting on armor involved faith, luck, and at least one friend pulling while another pushed from the other side. You might imagine that under those thick tunics and padding, they were feverishly toasty. But in truth, they were what historians refer to as just slightly less miserable. Wool may be king in cold weather, but even it has its limits when paired with a stiff wind, snow flurries, and the unfriendly smirk of a frostbitten visor. Still, fashion had its part to play. Enter the hooded cloak, the medieval equivalent of the modern heated blanket, without the convenience of electricity or, say, softness. These cloaks were often lined with fur, sometimes fox, occasionally squirrel, and in one very specific Bavarian garrison, rather unsuccessfully, with nettles. Those poor chaps warmed up precisely once, when they feverishly removed the nettle-lined cloaks and ran screaming into the nearest fire-warmed chamber. But one of the most curious winter allies the guards had was their own breath. Yes, their steaming, misty breath wasn't just there to draw silly moustaches in the air. Guards on long shifts would often huddle in groups, sharing warmth the same way sheep, penguins, and people reluctantly bonding over awkward small talk in modern elevators do. It wasn't glamorous, and it often smelled like onions and regret, but it worked. The collective warmth of half a dozen guards pressed together, made for a makeshift portable hearth, pungent but functional. Inside the walls, the true heroes of winter were braziers, metal boxes filled with coals, purpose-built for gently toasting extremities and occasionally catching someone's pant leg on fire. Guards posted inside hallways or gatehouses would shuffle closer to them during downtime, feet outstretched like cats that came with helmets and spears. You'd frequently find a particularly senior guard parking himself right next to one and simply not moving for hours, except to tap his boots together dramatically, like it was a Shakespearean performance of Too Cold for This Garbage. Now, when braziers weren't enough, and huddling like layered sardines failed to deliver comfort, guards sometimes employed a lesser-known tactic: strategic complaining. While it didn't warm their bodies, it certainly warmed their spirits. Endless orations about who had the worst post, the stiffest armor, or how Sir Gregory was definitely hoarding firewood behind the stables created a sort of verbal insulation, a cocoon of shared suffering. If you whined well enough, someone might even bring you hot mead, or more likely, tell you to keep your helmet on so they didn't have to hear it. Ah, yes, hot drinks. This was the golden chalice amid frigid watch shifts. Whether mead, mulled wine, or a broth so salty it could flavor the Danube, warm liquids did wonders for morale. There are records, highly disputed but too charming to ignore, of guards boiling onions in ale and sipping it with the solemnity of tea-drinking philosophers. They called it guard stew, and it was either nourishing or mildly hallucinogenic, depending on who had last stocked the onion cellar. Occasionally, the guards would be joined by castle dogs, those noble, shaggy companions who served a dual purpose: furry alarm system and fluffy foot warmer. A few lucky guards even trained theirs to lie across their laps while they kept watch. This, of course, led to abrupt panic when both dog and guard drifted off in mutual snoring bliss, only to wake up hours later covered in frost and surprisingly cheerful. Amidst all these humble comforts, fur cloaks, ember-lit braziers, oversized dogs, and bowls of experimental soup, stood the truest remedy of all: hope. Hope that the sun might return within the week. Hope that another guard would be assigned to the North Tower next time. Hope that their pants weren't, once again, frozen to the bench. With each wintry breath, they stood not only against invaders, but also the creatively aggressive weather of medieval Europe. And as another icy gust swooped through the parapets and the moon darlingly winked from behind a cloud, the weary but resilient sentries tightened their cloaks, gripped their spears, and leaned, just barely, into each other for warmth. Let's step now, quietly, through a timber door creaking with age and comfort, toward one final chamber of warmth, of dreams, and of sleepy secrets yet to be told. In the dim hush that followed a medieval winter sunset, when the last frostbitten rays slipped behind stony walls taller than your local coffee shop, castle guards were settling into their final and most underrated duty of all: not turning into absolute icicles by first watch. By now, our brave goose-pimpling sentinels had tried every medieval method known to man, monk, or marmot. They huddled near hearths when no one was looking. They sewed rough woolen liners into every tunic and glove. They swore fealty to layers with the kind of heartfelt reverence usually reserved for kings. And yet, they still found themselves out in the icy dark, toes numbing inside greased leather boots, breath frosting in the wind like disappointed ghosts of warmer assignments. As they stood along parapets and paced lonely keeps, many took to odd rituals: cheeky little toe dances in their boots, whisper arguments with frost-covered helmets, as if debating whether their nose had truly frozen off. One famously composed entire imaginary ballads in his head to distract himself, entitled Ode to a Warm Turnip Stew. It reportedly had 9 verses and an interpretive scat interlude. The lucky ones found ways to warm up between rounds. Deep within the castle, near the kitchens, enormous hearths radiated a heat so glorious it would make a snowman weep slightly before melting in awe. The kitchen staff, unsung heroes in mittens, often let guards hang about on the sly. Of course, these same guards were often guilt-tripped into chopping wood or stirring porridge in exchange, which was fine, as long as one's moustache didn't fall into the gruel from all the thawing condensation. There were also furred cloaks, of course, treasures of warmth spun from sheep, bear, wolf, and less majestic beasts like whatever lived nearby and was foolish enough to be fluffy. Cloaks were lined, cloaks were layered, cloaks were sometimes stolen and solemnly returned with apologies knit from gilt and scarf fabric. Even castle dogs had their part to play. Burly mastiffs, who served as both guardians and ad hoc radiators. Guards not above humility often shared nooks with these snoring beasts, forming what archaeologists now dreamily refer to as thermal alliances. But on the wildest nights, when the wind howled like a banshee with a cold and the stars winked out beneath icy clouds, the guards would tell stories, not because they were particularly brave or sweet-hearted, but because their teeth wouldn't stop chattering long enough to enjoy silence. Gathered in gatehouses or huddled along the least breezy parts of the wall, they shared tales passed on from centuries of chilly comrades. Stories of the cursed chicken that laid frostbitten eggs, of the ghostly wench who appeared only during the bleakest storms, offering mittens made of thin air and questionable fashion sense. They told of old Sir Barlowan, who once faced a blizzard so fierce, he roasted onions in his helmet and was henceforth known as Sir Sizzlehead. There was comfort in these retellings, the kind that masked real cold with laughter and gently ridiculous esprit de corps. As they watched night climb over the lands like a thick velvet curtain, guards fed their morale with humour warmer than any hearth. And finally, some simply leaned into the cold. They breathed in air sharp as needles, let frost cling to their lashes, and stared defiantly into the winds as if they were lesser foes than siege towers or peasant tax complaints. For them, each shiver was a badge, each icy breath a quiet proof of duty. They were, after all, part of something larger. Defenders of interminable stone, keepers of quiet walls, witnesses to 100 snowfalls and counting. Eventually, the bells would mark the end of their watch. They'd stamp their boot-numb feet down steep stone steps and disappear into those echoing corridors, heading for woolen blankets, hot drinks, or the arms of someone who'd already warmed an extra space on the rush-stuffed mattress. Outside, the castle would sigh, its stones releasing a puff of chill, as if exhaling the day's collected silence. Snow might continue, or pause, or dance idly past towers. Owls blinked like tired librarians and tucked further into beams. And just like that, the night went on without fire or frenzy. Just the old heartbeat of wood in windows, wind in loops, and the last of the guards gently warmed by stories once more. Now, my gentle dreamer, the torches are low, the keep is asleep, and somewhere, a castle guard leans against a cold granite wall, smiling slightly, wrapped in a quilt of centuries. Let the cold fade now, wrap up snugly. The world outside can wait till morning.